This is Leadership Beyond, your community of conversation.
But this is the first time in my professional career that everybody, 100% of us, are consciously aware we are engaged in the change initiative.
Yeah, everything. I mean, COVID caused us all to go through change, right? At the same time, but our experiences were so different.
Facing these unprecedented times in isolation is pure insanity.
Joining us today is Ann Latham. She's the founder of consulting firm Uncommon Clarity. Her clients are world-class organizations represented in over 40 industries. Ann is widely considered an expert in strategic clarity and strategies for improving productivity, performance, and commitment.
If you would have asked me before this interview, Tom, are there a lot of areas you need greater clarity? Without hesitation, I would have said yes. But then I wouldn't have any idea what to do about it. What I really like about this book is it's clear, not surprising since it's a book on clarity, and it's accessible.
One thing that I realized was I've been in a 20 plus year career of unproductive meetings without clarity, working with leaders who are fantastic at their craft, yet probably lack clarity. And Ann takes us through an exercise where we become aware of the disclarity and how to gain that clarity to be better for ourselves and for our organizations and for our people. Make sure that you check out her new book, available now, The Power of Clarity, and we'll make sure to provide links to her website and to her book in the show notes.
Let's welcome Ann Latham. Good morning, Ann. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Well, if to start with, just give a little background and tell us how you got into being passionate and teaching clarity.
Well, there's a big question. so I was a math major. I was a software engineer, problem solver after that, and from there I grew into solving more people-related problems and got into management and worked my way up the corporation. And so solving problems was always my thing, and the transfer to management was a big deal. I mean, because then you start having a broader impact, and that was a good thing. But before I decided I wanted to become an independent consultant and leave the corporation, and before I left, I asked all my colleagues, former bosses, peers, everyone I could think of, what is it I do exceptionally well that is most unusual? And the answers I got back were wonderful, thoughtful answers, and they all pointed to, I create clarity. I take in massive quantities of information and cut to the chase, find the kernel, find the most relevant piece, and move it forward. Or I dig through complicated issues and get everyone on the same page and move things forward. So I called my company Uncommon Clarity, and the URL was available, so that was easy. And then I started consulting, but no one was going to buy clarity because they don't really know what it is. There's not a sense of urgency around it. There wasn't, it's like mom and apple pie. It's everyone says, well, that's nice. We could use some of that, but that's not the problem they're trying to solve. So I brought my skills for creating clarity to strategic planning and process improvements and team effectiveness and all that kind of thing. But meanwhile, I was writing about clarity, how I do what I do. And in my new book, The Power of Clarity, I've really tried to capture everything about the facts. I mean, the first chapter is we aren't as clear as we think we are, bringing people to the realization that there is a problem. So there might be some urgency, but then really teaching people how I go about creating clarity and improving results and improving commitment and empowerment and confidence as a result.
Wow, are you needed everywhere?
Yes.
20 plus years of lack of clarity, experiencing the meetings and the work and the leaders who have not been able to effectively guide lots of small and large teams. And to think of how unproductive and costly that is.
Right. I mean, meetings are a great example because we spend enormous amounts of time in meetings, and most people will agree that there's very little that comes out of most meetings. And the whole problem is because we start meetings without knowing what must be different when we're done.
Well, there's something that really caught my attention with meetings. And in order to correct these ineffective meetings, there's a tendency at the last minute, I think you call it saving the meeting, to come up with action items. And nobody has any idea if they're a priority or not because we don't have clarity, but yet we feel like we're doing something. And then we get back to our cubes, this is so my life, and say, what is it I agreed to do? And my intention was to contribute. And off we go.
Right. And all we do is add to our to-do list that way. And it's not necessarily related to the most important thing that the company's trying to create or accomplish.
That meeting was even trying to accomplish
Exactly.
as it aligned to the higher strategy.
Right. The problem is when you go into a meeting without a clear purpose, very specific, this must be different when we're done, take the number of people in that room and feed them a general topic, and they will come up with dozens of different directions that the conversation can go. And of course, they're all vying for pushing their favorite direction, whatever their issue is, whatever their concern is, whatever their immediate need is. And they're all driving the meeting in multiple different directions. So at the end, if we try to save the meeting by figuring out, what did we accomplish? And we brainstorm these action items that came out of all of this lovely, interesting conversation. We can come up with tons of action items, but they aren't necessarily what needed to be achieved.
Yeah.
So if I can take you through an example, this is something that I do now. So I think I'm going to learn a better way. Thinking I need to be productive. I'm pulling a group of people together. I must have an agenda. So I'll have an agenda, and there will be 5 or 6 things to get through, those topics to get through. And I will take notes, and I will make sure that we're documenting what is our next step towards that agenda item. And yet, to your point, we have now walked out of a meeting that I think is very well run and productive, and we've got a list of to-dos. So how do you make that better?
Well, it's funny because you started off by saying you have an agenda. And yes, people, I think it was a number of, quite a few decades ago that people said there has to be an agenda. So
Right.
Everyone started making agendas. And frankly, these agendas were mostly terrible because they're filled with what I call treadmill verbs. And treadmill verbs are verbs like report, review, communicate, share, all the things you see on agendas. And the reason I call them treadmill verbs is because there's no way to know when you're done. It's like being on a treadmill. You never reach a destination. You can review forever. You can report forever. You can always report for another 10 minutes. You can always discuss for another 10 minutes, or communicate, or share, or inform. And those are the words that end up on too many of our agendas. And yes, they will lead to all kinds of interesting conversations again.
Yes.
And who knows what kind of action items will come out of them. People know that I really think that meetings are a big waste. So they often will tell me about great meetings they went to. And I'll say, okay, well, so what made it great? And it's usually things like, well, everyone stayed focused. They stayed on topic. And the topic was interesting. And, no one was uncivil. It's like,
and we had action items.
Where are the outcomes, And yeah, maybe they said there were action items, but they may have achieved those by saving the meeting instead of walking in with what tangible, concrete outcome are we going to have when we walk out that we don't have going in? And it has to be something that unleashes progress. It has to be a decision or a plan or a list of items or resources or something that contribute to a plan, or it has to be approval. It has to be something concrete, tangible that moves things forward. Otherwise, it's a waste of time.
Talk about destination verbs.
Right. Well, destination verbs are the flip side of the treadmill verbs. And while there's lots and lots and lots of treadmill verbs, there are very few destination verbs that really matter in the business environment if you want to get something done. The first one is decide. Decide is a destination verb because when you've made your decision, you're done. You know it. You've unleashed progress and you can move on. The next one is plan. When you create a plan, you're done when you've got the plan. You've unleashed progress. Now you can go implement your plan and move on. The third one is resolve, a problem resolution. When you resolve the problem, you're done. You know it. It's obvious. The fourth one's a little different, and it's a simple list. And the reason the list is on there is because when you made your list, you thought of everything you can put on that list. You're done. It's great. But that list has to be a contributor to either a decision or a plan or a problem resolution. So it might be a list of objectives in making your decision, or a list of alternatives for your decision, or a list of action items for your plan, or a list of resources for your plan. But if you're specific about what you're making a list of, it's very concrete, tangible, and it moves you forward. The fifth one is confirm. Confirmation goes like this. You walk into a meeting or something and you say, okay, I've done this so far, and now I'm going to do this. Am I on the right track? And all you want is a yes or no. You want confirmation, I'm on the right track. And of course, we all know what really happens. People start filling you with advice and talking about something 10 steps down the path. You're not even able to listen because you're not there yet. But confirm is a very simple outcome. It's, I am here. I want to go here next. Is that a good idea? Am I on the right track? And if someone says yes, you can move on. You've unleashed progress. If someone says no, then you can go offline and talk to someone and figure out, what am I missing? The sixth one that's important is approval. Like confirmation, it's very simple. It's, this is where I am. This is what I want to do, or we want to do. Do I have approval to implement? Can you authorize this? And when you grant someone approval, you've unleashed progress. They can move on. You've got tangible progress. Or you could be back discussing and informing and communicating. But those six are absolutely critical to progress. And like I say, unleashing progress and being able to move on to next steps. But those are the words that should be on your agenda. What am I going to decide? What are we going to list? What are we going to plan? What are we going to confirm? What are we going to authorize? What are we going to resolve? And then you walk out with something concrete.
And it's a very simple, tangible way. If we're practiced in thinking about just rattling off agenda items, it's probably just a little reframing to get to the outcome of that topic you want to discuss. And if there is no outcome to achieve, then probably it's not an agenda item.
Right. And sometimes it's a very simple little reframing, as you said, but sometimes it's much more important than that. For instance, put the words project review on your agenda, and you've unleashed, you've opened the barn door. It's a disaster. I do an exercise when I'm speaking to audiences sometimes where I have people pair up in the audience and I say, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to brainstorm the number of different directions the conversation could go with the agenda item project review. And typically people can come up with 20 or 30 in 2 minutes. And collectively in one group, not even a very big group, we had 67 different directions that conversation could go. You know, it's everything from customer concerns to budget to schedule to materials to supply chain issues and you know, quality issues. It can go anywhere. And the thing about this is that the more vested the participants, the smarter they are, the more engaged they are, the more directions they can take the conversation. So what do you really need to be different in relative to your project before you walk out of that meeting? Do you need a list of risks? Do you need to understand what plans I'm changing that might affect your plans? Get those plans in there, right? It's my plan, it's your plan. How do they mesh? Do you need a list of additional resources. So by using those 6 destination verbs, you can really nail down something very specific that's going to move your project forward instead of a lot of talk.
And if you have on the agenda a list of things we're going to talk about, that's not the destination. That might be the function, but you can have interesting conversations on everything on the list and think you covered the agenda. And
Exactly.
as you pointed out, not at all.
Right. Yes.
Where would a brainstorming meeting fit in then? I've been in several very long sessions where we're brainstorming. So it's, the rules are throw everything at the wall, right? Like
Right.
that's the purpose of it.
Brainstorms fit in almost anywhere. So for instance, if you're making a decision, one of the steps, by the way, I think of the 4 steps to make a decision, and most people start with number 3 and they don't ever get to number 4. So step number 3 in making decision is to look at alternatives. What are our options? So that could be a brainstorming session. Let's brainstorm as many alternatives and options as possible. And that's a good thing to do, because a lot of times one of our biggest problems is we don't consider enough alternatives. We glom onto we come up with a couple, we glom onto the most exciting, and we move on before we ever give other ideas a chance. The first step of making a decision is to decide, what decision are we making? And that's it sounds totally ridiculously simple, but most decisions are actually part of a series of cascading decisions. And when we sit down and make a decision, we're usually talking about multiples of those at once. I was in an executive team meeting one time where I was going to be talking to the team about a project I was planning to do with them. And they had an urgent matter come up. So they asked if it was okay if they dealt with that first and if I would just wait. So I sat there patiently waiting and going crazy because they dove into this urgent issue. And after about 3 to 5 minutes, I interrupted them despite their glaring eyes. Who are you to interrupt us? And said, do you realize you are talking about 5 different decisions and 2 different plans simultaneously? And they're still glaring at me. So I listed the 5 decisions and the 2 plans. And then the anger just dissolved into energy once they realized that I was completely right. Furthermore, it was totally obvious what order they needed to make those 5 very specific decisions in, and what they needed to do with this first steps of those 2 plans. Instead of, I swear, they would have talked for an entire hour and then had to schedule another meeting if I hadn't interrupted. But instead, they made those 5 decisions. They laid the steps of 2 different plans, and they were done in less than 15 minutes. And we moved on. So the number 1 step there is, what is the decision? So a brainstorming, you were asking about brainstorming, could be, wait a minute, what decisions here are we really have to make? And then what order do we have to make them in?
You use this term very quickly today, but it knocked me off my chair, cascading decisions. And you started with a bold statement. Most big decisions aren't as big as we think. They're a series of smaller decisions, and we often don't pay attention to us. So all of us are doing cascading of decisions all the time. But I think that term needs more clarifications because it was so obvious. I've missed it for 20 some years.
Yeah. Well, let's take an example where that you all would all be familiar with, everyone be familiar with, and that's buying a car. So if you walk into a group of people, your friends, and you say, I'm thinking about buying a car, you're going to get tons of advice thrown at you. And there'll be everything from, are you thinking about an electric car? Are you, I think you should get a Jaguar. I think you should get a truck. What are you going to use that car for commuting? Which car are you going to replace? But when you think about it, they're talking about all kinds of different decisions with all these random comments. So one of the first questions is, what do you need a new car for? That's just one. And I'm not going to necessarily get these in the perfect order that you would make them in, but which car are you going to replace? What are you going to use it for? Is mileage important, or is comfort important? What about, the brand, is status important to you? Do you need 4 doors? Do you need 2 doors? Do you need a lot of storage space? I mean, there's just a multitude of decisions in there that you could discuss. And if you think about it, are you going to rent or lease? I mean, so when you just throw out the idea of buying a car, people are going to talk about every single one of those different decisions, and you're going to get all these different ideas. And you need to figure out where do you want to start here? Which decision matters first?
And so when that's missing, we have a lot of conversations that may be interesting, but don't add to getting to the decision that matters when it matters with
Absolutely.
the resources necessary. That is so powerful, so simple, and so missing.
Yep.
I'm feeling the sense for, as you were explaining the process of deciding what kind of car to buy. And of course, all of those questions are good questions that should be considered. And how do you know which is the highest priority? And what comes to mind is, well, you have all these things coming at you, all these inputs from others, and it's being quiet long enough to decide what is the most important factor in deciding which car to buy. For me, not for everybody who's giving me all this input, or for the organization or the team or whomever, right?
Well, and that the first question isn't, should you get a Ford or a Toyota, or, what brand do you care about? It isn't, should you get a red car? It isn't. I mean, the decisions that are important are way upstream. How will you pay for it? What car are you going to replace? What are you going to use it for? Once you get some of those figured out, then you can get down to figuring out what kind of car you want. But
you've automatically filtered,
irrelevant,
by making those bigger, more important decisions.
So you're pointing to it, but let's be more specific about process clarity. And you've done so much of it in Adrian's example. You just gave us a process for knowing where to start. But talk a little bit, not only about the importance of process clarity, but how you can get to process clarity.
Right. It's a good question. I think process clarity is of the utmost importance. It's one of 3 pillars of clarity and achieving clarity. Process clarity is attention to how you're going to get somewhere. And when you think about it, I keep talking about you need a concrete, tangible outcome that you're striving for. Process clarity, I actually redefine the word process as, instead of a series of steps, it's a series of intermediate outcomes that lead to your final outcome. So each step of a process should create this tangible, concrete item, cognitive object, whatever it is that's going to move you forward. And if you don't have a process, if you don't know what you're working to, you're wandering. You're wandering around. And, a fishing trip, you're guessing, you're hoping, it's wishful thinking. But a process can be anything from a large strategic planning process for the organization. What are the concrete steps we need to achieve? What are the concrete intermediate outcomes do we need to achieve in order to get to a strategy? Or a process can be a simple thing as a decision process, a standard process you use to make decisions, because there are 4 things you need to achieve to get to a decision that are tangible, concrete outcomes. And your process could be a standard practice in your organization that's somewhere in between this little building block decision-making process and a giant strategy process. But anytime you're not following a standard or well-defined process, you should be paying attention to what process am I following. If I sit down at my desk to tackle, I'm working on a new book right now, so I'm sitting down to write a book. I need a process. I knew what's my, first of all, the first question is, what will be different by the end of this session? What am I going to achieve? What is this section of my book going to accomplish for my reader? Okay, what are the intermediate outcomes that lead to that within writing my book? And how am I going to, or writing that section? And what's my process for doing this? Do I make an outline? Do I do the subheadings first? How am I going to get there in an efficient, effective manner? Because I'm sure you've had the experience. If you just start typing, you're going to wander over here, and then you're going to talk about this, and then you're going to go, ooh.
So your answer to Adrian's question had that all in it, which is if you know where brainstorming fits
Yep.
in your bigger process, and that our outcome is to generate alternatives, and then you have a way to get from looking at all those alternatives when you put the black hat back on and don't just keep generating more alternatives. At some point, you pick one and then you keep moving. So there's a decision process. And often what happens is all making the list. So you've given two examples. They're all perfectly well and good within a process if they're contributing to a clear outcome and they have their own outcomes.
Absolutely.
That just brought clarity to what we were talking about before. And,
Right.
and essential. And
Yeah.
Adrian, we have our work to do, and we're going to do that and report back to Ann, because I'm already seeing some things that we can do to build on that.
Yeah,
So
well, our natural wiring is not to go in a straight line.
And I've got a whole chapter in my book called "We Aren't Wired for Clarity."
Yeah.
And it
Yes.
explains exactly that, because
Well,
otherwise,
let's flip that around, because before you did that, you said disclarity is a natural state. By the way, I'd never heard the word. I'd heard unclear and chaos, but
Yeah.
disclarity, my spell check tried to tell me, and I said, add that to the dictionary, please. Disclarity.
right. Yes.
So talk
coined
about
that
our
term.
natural state before you.
Yes. Okay. So I coined the term disclarity because I got really tired of writing not clear enough, a little unclear, not very clear. And what I realized at some point was that we have this image of clarity that we don't really understand very well, but it's this little point floating around in space. And we always talk about we're not quite clear enough, we're a little unclear, as if we're just a little ways away from that point. Just a little nudge is going to get us there, right?
Yeah.
And then I look at all these examples, the ones I write about in chapter 1, that's called "We Aren't as Clear as We Think We Are." And I explain those stories. And then I say, well, think about clarity on a continuum from uncommon clarity to disclarity. So instead of a point in space that's clear, or maybe we're not quite there, think of uncommon clarity on one end and disclarity, the absolute opposite, on the other end. And I think most people think that they're clearer than they think they are. But as soon as you put uncommon clarity on one end, they're probably going, well, I'm probably not there. That's a little extreme. And they don't think they're totally unclear either. But when you start looking at the examples I put in the book, and then I ask the question, where would you put this example on the scale from disclarity to uncommon clarity? And the answer is almost always way down on the disclarity end of the spectrum, because we haven't been taught to be as specific as we need to be. We haven't been taught to pay enough attention to process, or we haven't been taught these standard processes that belong in our cognitive toolkit so that we can move things forward more effectively with a standard process. And we certainly have trouble with focus, which is the third pillar. So yes, disclarity, the total lack of clarity, is much closer to our normal state than clarity.
Well, I think this would be a good time to talk about the third. So replace ambiguity with specificity, defeat disorder with process clarity. And today we have cultural ADHD, regardless of our level of clarity.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about eliminating dilution and distraction so we can focus.
Right. Well, I talk in the book about cruising with confidence. And this is the state of clarity where you know exactly what you're trying to accomplish. You know how you're going to get there, and you are able to focus. You've got things lined up in front of you, and you can turn off distractions and disruptions. And that's when we really get in the groove, in the zone, some people say, whatever terminology, in flow you want to use, where we are confident, strong, determined, and we are super, super productive. That's the state we want, and that's the state you get with clarity. But distractions and disruptions are a huge problem in this day and age, a lot of which is caused by the fact that we are our own biggest distraction. We go and check email, we go and check Twitter or whatever your favorite social media might be. We are constantly jumping from one thing to another. And it's totally disruptive. You can't really get in the flow if you're constantly doing that. So the simple advice, my advice there isn't that different from a lot of other people. It's clear the decks, get rid of all the stuff in your peripheral vision that will distract you. Shut down all the windows on your computer that aren't absolutely essential to whatever task you're doing. Shut down your computer, or at least close it out. Turn off the disruptor on the phone, silence it, close the door. I keep one little 5x7 tablet on the side of my desk. And when something enters my head unbidden, but that would be a disruption, I will just jot it down. I've put it aside. I can deal with it later. And I get back to the thing that is on my desk, the only thing that is on my desk, so that I can keep focusing.
Well, I think the relationship between specificity of outcome, it's a lot easier to avoid distraction, because I think sometimes inadvertently I distract myself because I'm not really clear that what I'm doing is, and I almost said a top priority. I loved your statement about top priorities is redundant. But if I'm not clear that what I'm doing with this hour is priority, then these distractions are even more alluring than ever before. Maybe there's an email.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And if you are really clear that, I need to get this done, and I'm going to get this specific, concrete, tangible thing done before lunchtime, and that's a relatively finite time period. Sometimes it's 15 minutes out. What's going to be different at the end of this 15 minutes? And if you're really specific about that and you have a method, you're almost unstoppable. You're not going to go off and chase an email.
Yeah.
So I know one trick that, sometimes I've been waiting for an email from someone. So I need to check my email to see, because it's relevant to the task I'm doing. So I will literally say out loud, I'm going to go check that email for an email from so-and-so, and that's it. I look, gone, out of there.
Because you set up a filtration system. So
Wow.
if it's not that email, it's for later.
Exactly. I'm going to look for that, and that's it. Because otherwise it's, I don't have to explain what happens when you
the whole day goes by reading email and answering it.
Yep.
That's a great tip. I mean, shut the windows down, and I think also if it's something we want to be doing, something that we need to be doing that maybe we don't really want to be doing, but we know it needs to be done, those distractions become obviously, even more sparkly and more alluring to get to. But if we chunk that, you said, even if it's 15 minutes from now, so you make it a smaller chunk so that it's more attainable, rather than I'll spend the afternoon doing this thing I don't really want to be doing that I know I need to be doing. How easy is it to find so many other things to do because, you've got the whole afternoon. So I'll get to that in an hour. Here's
Right.
this other thing, much more interesting.
Right.
Great tip.
As long as what you're striving for is a tangible outcome. You're not just saying, well, I'm going to write for 15 minutes. No, I'm going to ensure that my reader walks away with this understanding at the end of 15 minutes. I'm going to empty my inbox in 15 minutes. I'm not going to just read email. I'm going to empty the inbox, whatever it is, it needs to be an outcome, not an activity. There's I think processes are often defined in terms of a series of steps, a series of activities. And I don't care about activities. I care about the outcome. What's going to be different when I'm done 15 minutes from now, or a half an hour, lunchtime?
Well, we have just a little bit more time here, and here is right where we are. So this is good, which is if you buy into the clarity that you bring the problem of ignoring clarity, that's very strong. I love the invoice, by the way. And so what is it costing you not to have clarity? Because you started by saying people don't buy clarity. They want clarity in order to do other things. But once you've read the problem setup, we now are buying into clarity. Now we buy into your pillar. And as we buy into the 3 pillars, this is where I am with this, I see them all being relevant. Then you talk about a toolkit. How do you get started going from disclarity to clarity once you've identified, I'm making this up, 15 different areas you could use more clarity? How do you get started with outcomes?
Well, the very first step, no matter where you are, is to eliminate clarity blindness. And that is to really understand that it needs to be a priority, because you can see the things you're doing that are unclear. So for instance, you need to start hearing treadmill verbs. Do you hear them, or do you just use them? Which you probably
Yeah,
do.
Adrian, report back to me.
I
on
use
what
them
that-
all the time.
I get
Yes.
it. Yeah.
So
So
if
just
you-
notice it
Yeah.
first.
Yeah, if you just started hearing treadmill verbs and going, oh my God, I can't say that. Now I need to
Yeah.
figure out what concrete, specific, tangible thing am I asking for? Right there, that simple little change will make an enormous difference in your productivity and what other people understand from you, so that it improves their productivity too.
All right, we got our work cut out for us, and we will report back to you
We
and to
do.
all the listeners, because this is just good timing for us. I don't think you can cultivate a leadership beyond without clarity of outcome.
I believe that, if you were an operations manager looking for a job and you didn't understand lean thinking, you didn't know about lean manufacturing, and you thought you could get hired, you'd just be laughed out of the office, but I believe in the near term, it won't be that long before a leader who is applying for a job and doesn't understand the power of clarity will have not a chance at getting that job. It will be a fundamental qualification to understand just how unclear we are and what we have to do to change that.
Yeah. And how to break through all of that noise to get the clarity.
Yes.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And please send us whatever you want in the show notes in terms of links to get a hold of you. We're going to put a link to the Power of Clarity book and to your website. But if there's anything else, articles or that you want to draw attention to, just send us the links and we'll publish them.
Absolutely. I'll do that.
And open-ended, leave the audience with whatever you'd like to leave us with.
Well, I encourage you all to read the book, because the whole point of the beginning of the book is to help you see how unclear you are. I know that doesn't sound
It
nice.
worked.
Yes.
Believe me, everyone who reads the book says, wow, yes, this is eye-opening. And once you understand that you're not as clear as you think you are, then the opportunity for improvement might be a fourfold factor in productivity. It will increase your confidence, because if you are really clear about what you're trying to accomplish and how and with whom you need to work and are able to focus, you will knock down walls to make that happen, because your confidence will grow. And the other benefit is your ability to empower others, because you can empower others through specificity, process clarity, and focus as well. So I highly recommend you read the book, and then let me know what you think. Post it on LinkedIn.
We shall.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ann, for your time today.
Thank you. It's been great
Thank you.
talking to you.
And we'll get in touch with you on published dates, and we'll stay connected. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Beyond podcast. We hope you benefited from this conversation as much as we have. We invite you to join our community of conversation. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Don't forget to sign up at aleadershipbeyond.com for free materials and updates. That's aleadershipbeyond.com. Join us in 2 weeks for our next episode.